Hey everyone, this is Dr. Matt from the Ethos Athletes Podcast, and today we're doing episode 3 of our nutrition series where we're learning about using macronutrients for athletic performance. And on our episode today, just like the rest of the nutrition series, we have Kelli Michelle from Keep Moving Forward that's here as our guest today to talk about our particular topic. Kelli holds a master's in nutrition science from ASU. She has a NASM certification, and she's a sports nutrition specialist. Kelli, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
So today we're talking about macro tracking for athletic performance. And I know some of the questions that I get is when you're considering macros and athletic performance, where do you start and how do you know where to tweak different ratios and stuff?
Yes, that's a good question, Matt. Typically, when I get an athlete, the first thing that I want to make really clear to them is that I don't want to make their life more difficult. But there's a method to the madness, and it will require them to do some homework on their own. So even if they can give me a food log, a food journal, writing down exactly what they had, for a day or two, I can get kind of an idea of where the deficient areas are in their meals and also, their totals for the day. So when we look at macro tracking, I know we've focused a lot the last 2 episodes on macros in total. Where do the person's macros fall in total? And it's a different ballgame with athletes because it's actually important where those macros are coming for, just like it would be important for our fat loss clients, right? We don't want an athlete getting so lean that they now can't keep mass on and they're not performing as well as they performed when they had the extra muscle mass. So we particularly don't want them losing any mass. So it's important to look at what they're doing so that we can establish where they're headed and a method that you can explain to them about how you're going to get there and how long it's going to take reasonably. So when I get somebody, typically they're already tracking on MyFitnessPal. And again, I have no affiliation with Under Armour or MyFitnessPal. You can use any macro tracking device like we talked about in episode 2. But the best place to start is just to kind of get a general idea of how many macros you're eating at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then your totals for the day. I'm going to give you just, from my experience, what I normally see off of average athletes. Now, again, I'm going to break these down into 2 categories. Bodybuilders and recreational lifters. Okay, so people that go, recreationally to lift 3 to 4 times a week, or bodybuilders who run a 4 or 5 day split. Okay, I'm going to put them in one category, and then I'm going to go ahead and put the Olympic training athletes, power lifters, Olympic weightlifters, people who have to work almost every day on technique work, and again, CrossFitters into the category of the elite athlete. And again, I'm not trying to stigmatize people who go to the gym and recreationally as not athletes. They are athletes too, just a different type of athlete. So when we're feeding a CrossFitter, is going to be very different than feeding somebody who is a recreational bodybuilder, who does not do the type of Metcon training or high intensity interval training with heavy weight training and for time, to be specific. So when I get somebody, I look at their overall averages, and somebody who is doing CrossFit is going to need a lot of fat and carbohydrates. They're going to need energy from carbs and fats in ratios that I usually would say fall around 30 to 35% fat, 40 to 45% carbohydrates, or even as high as 55 to 60 in some cases. And again, with CrossFitters, my biggest issue is a lot of them are not eating enough protein either for recovery, for muscle recovery. And most of the CrossFitters train 5 to 7 days a week. Sometimes they train 10 to 14 sessions a week, which, as you know, would be double days.
Yeah, absolutely.
You kind of can't out-eat that training volume. And so it's very difficult to feed somebody like that because, we always want to stay behind the 8 ball. So if I look at their percentages just based off of what my normal intake interview looks like, typically they're a little low in carbohydrate intake. And I would say that as a universal rule for Olympians as well, or people who are training for the Olympics or competitively. I would say overall, they tend to be lagging most in the carbohydrate intake percentages. So typically, that's an easy fix for me. I can work on that first. They see very minimal weight gain at all, which is awesome. because typically the body just sees it, likes it, and rips right through it. Most of these people too are eating under maintenance level calories for the amount of output they do. I very seldom get somebody who's actually eating at or above maintenance or in what we call a surplus. A lot of these athletes too have to make weight for their meets, so they're very concerned with it. I wouldn't treat them any differently than a normal average person who has a lot of food rules. They come with food rules too. And they think, a lot of times that they're going to be able to out-supplement their deficient nutrition areas. And that's just not the case. So nonetheless, then we go to the bodybuilding population, and what I see there is completely different from the average gym goer. So I'm going to put them in the same category because the variable of training is close to the same. They might work out for 45 minutes to an hour and a half, 3 to 4 days a week. And sometimes they do a little cardio on a machine. So, I wouldn't say that they're intensely pushing sleds and such like the CrossFitters. Some of them do, some of them don't. But again, if we go back to average everyday gym goer, what the deficient areas that I see with them are typically protein. Protein is always a little bit too low, or oftentimes too low. Carbohydrate intake is usually pretty sufficient, and their fats are typically fairly low as well. And a lot of the people that come from a bodybuilding background will come in very high protein, very low carb for their body composition, and obviously for muscle retention. And they will come in a little bit low on fat as well. So for the first week, what I do is I analyze what they're eating. Usually I'll try to increase their calories the first week that they're with me by 100 to 200 calories, depending on if it's female or male. And I'll start them very close to their average intake, but I'm going to shift the percentages closer to where I need them, which again, for somebody who's a bodybuilder, if their goal is overall composition and strength, I might keep their fat between 25 and 30%, where if somebody's prime goal is fat loss, it would be under 25%. Carbohydrate intake usually stays around the same until we get the fat loss person to a place where we do need to cut carbohydrates in order to see them get leaner. Okay. And sometimes it will require cutting fat to a very uncomfortable place as well. So I hate to go that direction. I usually like to use the building phase or the reconstructing phase the first month and a half to be teaching them to have balance in their diet. And that would lead me to the adherence portion, which has been very difficult for a lot of these athletes because they have a million things that they have to track. Tracking can be very daunting to athletes because it's another area that they have to be structured. And I feel like the athletes that I work with do very well with me because I learned by default that you have to give them vacations from tracking, diet breaks, if you will. A break from putting everything into the system and weighing it on the scale. I don't think that a lot of the athletes that are not concerned with their overall composition or making weight within, say the next 2 months really need to be hung up on the scale, the actual weight scale every morning. They have a little bit better capacity to be more flexible with their nutrition, having some of the things that they really like around their training sessions or whenever they might want to enjoy those so that they can keep adhering to the program. That's one of the things that my athletes talk about that they like with macro tracking and flexible dieting, but I've also seen it go the other direction. So I've also seen people become more orthorexic.
Yeah, that's so extreme.
Yeah, which, I blame several people, and I'll take responsibility too for when I first started flexible dieting. Because I'm such a science person by nature, I wanted to, establish as little variable as possible. Mm-hmm. Well, you kind of cannot do that with everybody. You have to be very careful about who you micromanage and who you allow to have more flexibility. You don't want to take somebody who has a prior eating disorder related history, a lot of athletes do, and put them on such a strict plan that it becomes just like a job. It's not even fun for them. Because a lot of these Olympic athletes too have been doing this type of training and in a routine since they were little kids. Everybody needs a break from that. So with my athletes, I try to get them to a fully functional place where they're enjoying their nutrition. And then, I will say, hey, we have 6 weeks to get you to weight. Here's how it's going to look. The last week is going to be very hard for you, but usually it's the last 6 weeks that are really hard for you. So we're going to come in really nice and steady, and the last 2 weeks we're going to have to go a little bit, harder, but not harder in terms of what you've already done, because usually you were running, starving, sweating, having to do all these water pulling methods, where now all you're going to have to do is manipulate your food. We might have to manipulate water 1 out of every 5 times, and it's usually with a female who starts their cycle the week of their event. So, that's okay. We can plan ahead for that. We also look at that in patterning. It's why, when we did podcast number 2, we talked about what a reasonable time frame for these people looks like.
Right.
If I have 6 weeks, there's not a whole lot of testing that I can do, because a female will have a cycle 1 time within that 4-week, period, and they're not going to have a second one that I can see. Does it duplicate the results of the first one? Is the water fluctuation the same? Is the weight fluctuation the same? Do they still feel in the second cycle like they felt in the first one when they weren't supplementing iron? How do they feel now when they have B12? So there's a lot of things that we can do in a 2 or 3 month frame that we can't do in a 6-week frame, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next thing, I think, there's a huge stigma out there, especially in the bodybuilding industry, about protein consumption and that more is better. And we just have all the information and all the evidence and all the data now from 2017 and 2018, and obviously even 2015 and 2016 as being huge muscle protein synthesis research years, right? The outcome is this, again, you don't need to have more than 1.2 grams per pound of body weight for protein. But if you are in a calorie deficit, you might need a little bit more than that, say, 1.4 to 1.6, depending on how low your carbs are. But that's where I think lies the biggest gray area, where, with nutrition, it's not black or white. There's gray area in everything. The gray area is the unknown. How low do we have to get this person in carbs to get their stage body fat to 4% or under, right? So if we're talking about like bodybuilders, how low will we have to get the person's carbs to get them to actually hit weight for an Olympic lifting meet or a wrestling meet match? Those things are all things that we have to take into consideration. So to practice those things would be better. For a bodybuilder, that's not really something that they can practice, because let's face it, they're not going to prep and diet and then prep and diet again. So we really would want to be an expert at nailing, carbohydrate intake in the reverse, and knowing how much food do we need to have in this person's diet to get them to 4% and not have them be miserable. Obviously, it's always going to be miserable once your body fat gets fairly low. You're going to feel pretty crappy anyhow. We see a lot of athletes that are, sub 10%, and especially men that are sub 6, sub 5, that have such a loss of libido. I'm sure you rehab a lot of those guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Their workouts are pretty terrible. They don't really have a whole lot of joy, because again, the ghrelin and leptin levels are off, and their cortisol's typically off, and hunger hormones are at an all-time high because they need a refeed, right? So then once they get through the bodybuilding side of things and they do the competition, or if we're even talking about people that are just trying to get their body fat down really low, we'll have women athletes that'll come in and haven't had a cycle in a year and a half, and I'm like, okay, your goal is to lose more body fat? Well, I'm not your coach,
right? Because
again, I'm not going to take you there and damage your hormones further.
Absolutely.
To get you to 6%. I don't know why you're chasing this number. Is there something about 6% that you need? And I will be honest, CrossFitters are not immune to this syndrome. It's strength and aesthetics syndrome.
Right.
They want it all. Money, fat, cars, diamond rings, champagne, gold chains, every damn thing. They want it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a lot of people do. It's not just the CrossFitters. I'm not picking on the CrossFitters. There's plenty of people in the fitness industry that are chasing, perfection and chasing some of these narcissistic things, and they'll go to any degree to get it. I mean, we talk about sport performance enhancements. It's not just being used in obviously bodybuilding. It's being used in the Olympics. It's being used in, training all over the place. It's being used in high volume training. It's being used in powerlifting. It's being used in Olympic lifting. It's being used in CrossFit. For sure.
Yeah.
Even though, all of these sanctions claim to be clean, there's things that fly under the radar. So again, that is personal preference. But if I was going to feed somebody, it would be a lot easier for me to feed them knowing that there are these great variables. People who are, on hormone replacement therapy, if, maybe you can add a little bit to that, Matt. When people do come in for HRT, do they expose themselves to you, especially if they're athletes, and say, this is what I did as an athlete for 10 years, and I'm pretty certain that by correlation, this is what's led me here, is that I was eating this way and it was not exactly...
Yeah, and that's a great distinction to make. I mean, there's definitely times when I've had people come in and they were an athlete of some sort in their life, and they may have been doing testosterone or some other performance enhancer, and a lot of times if they don't offer that up, I do ask the question, because there is a correlation between the two. If you were on a performance enhancer of some sort, did you also have some sort of dietary behavioral pattern that I need to know about, or that's currently still affecting you? And so you definitely need to take that stuff into account, because a lot of times they do correlate with each other, and you see that.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then people not having the education on how to come off the drug properly,
exactly.
And the counterbalancing effect of estrogen and progesterone is too, which I think everybody demonizes testosterone as being the thing that affects all things, that it does not. It is not a demon. They all work together. Obviously, the endocrine system's a delicate thing. We have hundreds of hormones, and they can all be affected. And if we've got one brain off, and we've got another brain, the gut and the actual brain, we've got something off, there's going to be problems throughout the whole system, right? So that would bring me to the next controversial topic, which is carbohydrate restriction in athletic performance. That is something that I see. It's very, very prevalent. It's not just prevalent in the athlete community or in the bodybuilding community. It's also very prevalent in the Gen Pop community.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about, sarcopenia, and in the second episode, with Gen Pop, being such an issue with underconsumption of protein, but it's really underconsumption of protein and carbs that can lead to, muscle loss. So we're putting some of these athletes, and I know that, coaches aren't doing this intentionally. Nobody wants to hurt an athlete intentionally. I don't think anybody in our industry sets out to hurt people. We're here to help people, but it's happening. And so it's very, very important that if you have an athlete, and especially a young one, that you're not feeding them, low carb. Because again, when the body is depleted of glycogen and glucose, it's going to go looking for a protein source as fuel. Because again, if they're low in fat and carbs, and that's why it's very important to get these macronutrient goals hit, and precisely for the person's maintenance level, you can start them as low as you want, but you better have a method and a path to get the areas that are deficient up to sufficient quickly. And I mean quickly, within 6 months. Because I'll be honest, for every, 6 months to a year that you leave somebody eating in a deficit, it can cost them a lot hormonally. So, carbs are not the demon. In fact, you look at the difference between like a cyclist and an endurance athlete. They're going to need a sufficient amount of carbs, way more carbs than a bodybuilder or a utility lifter or somebody that's just an average gym goer. These people are sometimes putting in 2 or 3 hours of cardio zone based training, which means they're burning primarily carbs for fuel. They're not burning, primarily fat for fuel. They're burning primarily carbohydrates for fuel. Where, you look at the difference between, resting heart rate and working heart rates on endurance athletes versus people who lift weights recreationally. And typically the people that are lifting weights are close to the fat burning zone. They're not, unless they're doing the metabolic conditioning like a lot of the CrossFitters, they're not up in the cardio zone. There are some lifters that are lifting enough volume and not taking, rest between sets that are up in the cardio zone as well and would need more carbohydrates to fuel that type of training program as well. So you really do have to be on target with the carbs. And there's a lot of flexibility with carbs, which is awesome. It's not like fat where if you get somebody to a certain threshold, now they're going to start gaining body fat,
right.
And again, that's overall calorie consumption too. So you got to take into consideration the big picture. The big picture matters. You're not going to get fat from eating more carbs. You're not going to get fat from eating, more fat than what you're eating. It's just, are you at calorie balance, and are you near maintenance level, or are you eating in a surplus? So again, the same thing would go for athletes. I try to get them to maintenance or into a small surplus, not necessarily that they would be gaining body fat, but just maybe we get them to a place where they're actually adding some muscle, and then we go, okay, this person doesn't need to add more muscle. Their coach and their sport requires them to be here. We can back off on protein and carbs just a little bit, get them to that average tipping point, and increase their energy source through fat. So they have more fat for satiation, more fat for eating out, more fat for flexibility. Okay. Let's face it, the hardest thing with athletes is if they come to me eating so little, they can't enjoy anything off their plan because they don't have enough fat.
Right.
So, and that would go, across the board for Gen Pop bodybuilders. I see bodybuilders who come to me eating, 50% lower fat intake than where they should actually be, even just for proper hormone health.
Yeah.
And that is really scary. And I used to be one of those people. So, to go back to that direction is actually frightening. And I remember how I felt. And I remember where it landed me, and it landed me straight, into HRT. And I was a, 6-7 a day a week gym goer. Mm-hmm. It's just unnecessary for somebody. So that's why I separated the elite group into one group, because usually they're training 6 or 7 days, if not more sessions than that a week.
Right.
They have to. And then we've got, the average gym goer or bodybuilder. And again, bodybuilders, I commend them for the amount of commitment that it takes and dedication to get to that place. But on a different note, I would say I would throw caution to that sport only because of the amount of lean mass that they do need to obtain, and then the level of low body fat that they have to maintain during their cutting phase. And it is just imperative that those people actually do a rebuild of their metabolism and try to get their metabolism back up to healthy. And that typically will take about double the amount of time or triple the amount of time that they were actually in that calorie deficit.
Okay.
So if someone's been cutting for a show for 6 months or 4 months, 24 weeks, they would not want to do another show that year, or they're going to be repairing for a year to a year and a half. Okay. If this is something that they do for a career, my advice is to pick the best show for that year. Do it to the best of your ability, and then have a building season, a recovery season, a season where, you mentally bring your psychological aspect of dieting back to a healthy place too before you hit stage again. Very difficult, and I don't see it very often done successfully. In fact, I just listened to an awesome podcast this morning of another nutrition coach that I think, there's some bias there. I've competed, and I've done CrossFit. I did a CrossFit competition. That was interesting. I trained 10 days for that, and I decided that it wasn't my thing. But I did it, because I wanted to see what does this encompass? And are these movements functional enough for me? Because I'm a very purpose-driven training person. I don't do a lot of things. Like I did powerlifting too. Was that purpose-driven? No. I did about a year's worth of powerlifting, and maybe a little bit longer, obviously doing accessory work. And I will be honest, I was able to eat the most amount of food I've ever eaten in my life because of the volume. But for a smaller, girl who was not built for powerlifting, because I'm on the tall end, it was not a sustainable method, nor would I functionally do powerlifting for the rest of my life. Now, it's not to say that I don't squat, deadlift, and bench. I don't bench very often, let's face it, but squats and deadlifts are still a big part of my program, right? Because again, those movements are definitely beneficial if you're, gonna be an athlete like I am, and if you're gonna maintain, some of the accessory work. So those two movements are going to be in the accessory work, and so is in essence, you're still going to be doing some chest work. Mm-hmm. Whether it's bench, whether it's flies, whether it's push-ups, whether it's, incline pressing. All of those things for me are more functional because of what I'm going to be able to do long term with those movements, right? And again, that was a lot of food prep. So when you're feeding somebody like a power lifter, you also have to take into consideration that they're probably going to be able to eat a lot more calories at the high end of their training, which, you've got to prepare them for.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
It's an interesting thing when you get a power lifter because they come to you and they're eating, usually the power lifters are actually eating a fair amount of food because if not, they're not lifting very well. Or they don't tend to feel very well. But they're very astonished, like, oh my gosh, my reverse, I was able to add 600, 700, 800 calories. And I'm like, yeah, you probably could have done 1,000, to be honest. And they're like, really? Well, that's what I'll shoot for next off season then is. And they have a very open mind about it.
Yeah.
Because again, they're not worried about being 6% body fat on stage or 3 or, sub 10.
Okay.
So, so that's some of the differences between, where I start people. Percentage-wise, I would say, it probably would not be beneficial for anyone to start under 25% fat unless they're just coming in eating way under 25%.
Okay.
And then I would say, maybe start them close to their averages and just try to work the fat macro up because fat and carbs, the energy sources, in my opinion, is where I think people have the most fear. Oh, the word fat scares them. And we are such a fat-phobic society. Right? We truly are. You go anywhere and, you'll just see we are such a fat-phobic society. So I think, people have, even with macro tracking, demonized fat because some of the macro coaches, and I'm even guilty of this when I first started, because I didn't learn macro designation the way that I do it now. I learned it differently. And I did it that way for probably a good year before I was like, this is not the best way to do it. This is a better way and it's more efficient and I can get them to adhere better.
Okay.
Where there's still a lot of macro coaches out there and people that don't have the education out there and they're, setting people's fats so low that they're hurting people, and it's just one of those things where it happens, and if you leave them there, you're really doing them a disservice by leaving them that low.
Okay.
And again, it affects everything: hormones, adherence, satiation.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't really go to the store and get a burger, and you're supposed to be a flexible dieter, or you're supposed to have moderation. You can't even have a burger because you don't have enough fat in your budget.
For sure.
So, again, that's kind of where we can go with that. And then if you're talking about, or if we lean towards, how do we take an athlete from improving their performance from, where they're at to even better, that's where you have to become a little bit of a scientist and make each one of these people a case study.
Okay.
I give them different tasks to do each week too, because I know that, they're training so much that they're not sometimes focusing on hydration and sleep. Sleep and micronutrient intake, very, very important.
Absolutely.
For an athlete.
Yeah. At that level, for sure.
Yeah. You look at, energy balance as being the bottom of the pyramid, but right above that would be their micronutrient intake. And then obviously sleep and recovery. Training stimuli would be above that. And then supplementation would be at the very top of the pyramid, which is not very big, right? Because again, if they're getting what they need in their food and their meals and, protein supplementation and obviously in their vitamin, they shouldn't need to do a whole lot more, but some do need to.
Right.
So if we talk about that a little bit, most commonly, and again, there's a lot of myths out there about supplements. The 3 supplements that I would recommend, that have conclusive data behind them is obviously whey protein powder, isolate, and some of the other full leucine-based, full-chain amino-based protein powders. So protein consumption is obviously something that not everybody hits perfectly every day, so we might need to supplement that. I have a lot of athletes that don't need to supplement it at all. They actually eat all of their protein from, animal sources or vegan sources, vegetable sources. They don't need to supplement at all. That would be ideal, but let's face it, we're American. We live in a fast-paced world, so I always tell people, if there's one thing you can get, grab a good high-quality supplement. Again, I'm not sponsored by any supplement company, If you do the research out there, there's a lot of great products. A lot of my clients really like the Dymatize ISO 100, the gold standard by Optimum Nutrition. And again, I don't get any kickback from them, although I probably should. But ISO 100 and Dymatize has been a very reputable company the last few years, especially in the supplement reviews. You can do your own research and you can draw your own conclusion. I really promote people thinking for themselves and doing their own research on products. There's a lot out there too that is labeled healthy, and I tell my athletes, be very careful about the healthy brownie, the healthy protein bars, the healthy protein muffins, the healthy, it's like, if healthy is on any label, you guys, they will sell it. They will market it and they will sell it. It's the same thing with supplements. So the second one would be creatine monohydrate. Creatine monohydrate, obviously, you're not going to overdose on creatine monohydrate if you're kind of not the brightest light in the bunch. Again, creatine's awesome because it's not something that you have to necessarily cycle off of, although I would recommend coming off of it when you're not in a strength cycle, because why would you want to put more in your body than you need? People ask what should the time frame look like, and I'm like, well, we can only speculate on that really. So how about coming off of it every 10 to 12 weeks like your periodization? If you're in a heavy lifting cycle, why don't you come off of it after the heavy lifting cycle, and you can just add it back in the next heavy lifting cycle. Probably going to be better to caution on the side of, being a little bit more careful with things than over consuming things. And then obviously caffeine. There is a lot of data out there, guys, and it's conclusive, showing that caffeine is pretty darn good for performance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mental alertness, staying mentally alert. They've got a lot of nutraceuticals out there now too that have some other things mixed with caffeine, like the bitter orange. My clients love arginine, L-arginine, because it gives them kind of a tingle or a pump. To me, it makes me itchy, so I don't really prefer it. But a lot of people love it. So if that's your thing and you're chasing a pump, caffeine and a little L-arginine can be very good. Caffeine is just going to probably give you a little bit more bang for your buck, and you're not going to spend a ton of money on it. You can get it in the way of coffee. We have a lot of people out there that enjoy it. So with my athletes, I ask them please to stay off the coffee in the morning and use it for performance only.
Okay.
Again, I'm just trying to be more conscientious about, the adrenals, and obviously waking up in the morning and having your cortisol be high and not allowing your body to have a chance to regulate in the morning. And you get that first meal in. Caffeine typically does also make you less hungry. So my concern and my worry is that they'll have caffeine and then they're left eating all the rest of their food later in the day, and they're having a hard time hitting their macro goals because they woke up and they were like, well, I wasn't really hungry. Well, yeah, you had 8 cups of coffee. No wonder you weren't hungry,
Right.
So athletes are overconsumers as well. In fact, I'll be honest, I would put them in the 1 to 5% population, the elite athletes. They're overconsumers.
Okay.
Caffeine, energy drinks.
Oh yeah, for sure.
C4. Nothing against C4, but a lot of these pre-workouts. I'm going to be honest. I think maybe 1 to 3% of my client base, which is over 200 people, actually take pre-workouts, and a lot of my clients lift recreationally or as bodybuilders. I have a lot of aesthetic, based clients, Gen Pop. And my Gen Pop doesn't do it hardly at all. But I will say this, of that 1 to 3%, I would go as far as saying 5% of them hit the coffee and the caffeine pretty hard. So what would I say would be, the standard for overconsumption? I probably wouldn't exceed 400 milligrams in a day. That's quite a bit. The average American, I'm told, is between 450 and 1,000 milligrams a day.
Yeah.
Do you have any statistics on that?
I do have a statistic on it. I don't know off the top of my head, but I do have a paper that I read on that.
I was mind-boggled. I heard that, a couple weeks ago, and I'm like, is it really that high? And I don't drink coffee.
Right.
So anything alcohol and caffeine related always still is very shocking to me, just because it's not an area that, I pay close attention to because I don't overconsume it.
Right.
And my clients hear me and they listen to me, and I'm very, very good about not giving them too much information to hyper focus on, small, minute details, but enough to say, be cautious of this, you guys. You don't need to overdo creatine monohydrate if you're getting red meat into your diet, because there's creatine in the red meat.
Right.
So, be careful too that if you're going to have your hormone panels done and your protein panels done and you're looking at things, you may have elevated liver enzymes, you may have elevated enzyme levels if these things are being used a lot and they're being used for long duration. So, don't freak out and have $7,000 worth of lab testing done. You probably want to look at the things that you're doing every day first and cut those back.
Yeah.
You probably see that a lot too.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You're like, hey, is there any reason why your liver enzymes would be high? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you, and we see that very commonly with athletes. And, I know sometimes my creatinine level will come back a little high, and my hormone doctor will just go, how much are you lifting? And I'm like, no, I'm serious. It's not how much. It's just that the volume is, and my intensity level might be
a little more.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I don't just recreationally lift light weights. So that's probably got, some correlative evidence behind it as well. So that'd be a really interesting study to see, if we did a bodybuilding panel or we did a panel with people that lifted. The hardest part is just controlling that test population and getting them to do what you want them to do. So I see why they don't do a lot of studies on fit people, because you would have to do everything they want you to do. And, fit people are very routine. So they don't like people messing with the routine.
No, absolutely. So you had said, some of the ratios that you threw out for like your average CrossFit person would be like carbs at 40%.
40 to 50%.
40,
yeah.
Fat 30 to 35, then protein makes up. Yeah. So let's go with the lower numbers. So we'll say carb 40, fat 30, protein 30. Right?
Mm-hmm. Pretty standard. And, I've even seen CrossFitters do really well on a completely balanced split.
Okay.
33, 33, 33.
Okay.
Just give or take a little here or there. They do great. I'm going to be honest, I don't see any better results aesthetically. Unless the person started in a massive deficit.
Okay.
And then, obviously we get what we get, and we have to work from there. If I'm working somebody up from low fat, typically they will gain a little body fat, because again, fat is more calories. It's 9 calories per gram versus 4, where I can give somebody 10 grams of carbs and I can only give them, 4 or 5 grams of fat.
Right.
So, I'm very strategic about how and where I place the macros at first, just so that I can get them to a healthy place with their fats.
Yeah.
Especially CrossFitters. When you're doing that much high intensity interval training and sometimes 2-a-days, it's, again, like I said, you can't out eat that.
Right.
There's nothing you can do with your nutrition that's going to recover you from that type of training. We just have to do the best we can to fuel the person for that workout. And what you do yesterday is going to definitely impact you today. So when endurance athletes, are working with a nutritionist, and it always perplexes me when they say that the day of the race was the only day that they refed. I was like, what?
Right.
I would refeed you 3 or 4 days going into it, and I would want to know, even on your last hard cycling day, how'd you feel that day?
Yeah.
And we'll gauge what we do the day before based off of, how you're feeling, how you've recovered, how your sleep has been, that type of thing. So to your point, those are the things that you're looking for when you're looking to see when you're working on. Let's say you have that person on the 40, 30, 30, mm-hmm. and you're looking at potentially allocating or just making small changes. You're going based off how they feel. I am.
On those things that you just listed.
I'm going based off how they feel, and a lot of times even the marathon runners will need to be a certain weight, or they have a weight that they feel very comfortable carrying, and every pound makes a big difference to a competitive runner. Same thing with a cyclist. And so they get, even if they were to start adding muscle at some point, I would maybe want to ask them, so you've put on a half a pound of lean mass. Do you think that this has been a negative thing as far as performance, or do you think it's beneficial? And I'd say that the answers are 50-50.
Okay.
So again, I'd rely a lot on the coach, the endurance coach too, to say, I want this person at this weight and I don't want their lean mass up. I want them right at this weight. Well, that's easy for me. Once we hit it, we hit it.
Right.
And we maintain it.
Yeah.
But you're right, restructuring just a little bit, I go primarily based off how the person feels. And I will be honest, most athletes feel better on higher carb.
Okay. Yeah.
It also, I notice when I start taking some of their carbs away, even if they're so high, they're like, wow, can I have my carbs back? I'm like, dude, you have 265 grams.
Yeah.
You're not anywhere near depleting that on a daily basis. And
Right.
they're like, I know, but I just got really accustomed to having pancakes every night. And I'm like, okay, and so their reasoning for it may also bring them joy, which also might make them perform better.
Yeah, for sure.
Because their diet is more joyful.
Yeah, there's something to be said about that. Absolutely.
Totally. And, that's why, the takeaway from last weekend at the LA Dietetics Convention was just, balance in everything, but know your limitations with certain people. Know your limitations with athletes. Know your limitations with eating disorder-related behavior clients, that are still demonstrating that every week when they give you feedback. Athletes that are very conscientious about their aesthetics, the way that they look versus performance. Try feeding someone that's so freaked out about gaining 1 pound on the scale
Right.
versus performing well. It is very difficult as a coach. You are the carrot in front of the, and sometimes you don't know, move left, move right, move left, move right, but you have to test things and then you have to be okay with failing, People ask me all the time, has anybody ever missed a weight cut with you? I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
Remember, I'm not the engineer. I'm the conductor. Mm-hmm. I rely on the adult to do the work.
Right.
And these athletes are adults, but what we don't realize is, from a young age, they've been programmed to do things a certain way. And sometimes you have to be, as their new coach, you have to come to a place of, meeting in the middle, compromise. It's like that in any relationship. I think we were laughing about dating, but macros is a lot like dating, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's the same thing with an athlete. You guys are going to be dating for a long time. With your clients, you're going to be married for a long time. Some of you are going to be married for several years before they reach their goal, or they change their goal after they've reached their first and second goal. Now they've got a third goal that they want to accomplish. So those marriages become longer marriages, which, man, when you learn somebody, you are such a great coach.
Yeah.
When you don't have a long time to learn somebody, you're not as good of a coach. It's just like being married the first 2 years are hard, right? I don't know because I'm not married, but it's hard. You married? Yeah. Okay. It's hard. It's hard work. So when that third and fourth year approaches, a lot of times the feedback is, man, we're so good now. And then after that, it's like, if you can make it past that 10-year marker and you guys have a common goal. That's what I love about athletes is I'm the coach, they're the athlete, we have a common goal.
Right.
Our common goal is this. And so I'm working hard for you, you're working hard for me, where it's hard with Gen Pop. And I know we're going to talk about that next, but it's hard with Gen Pop. Sometimes you have to keep dangling little tiny carrots out in front of the person. And some people are awesome. They have their own goals and they stay very focused. But let's face it, we're a self-serving society.
Yeah.
And we want it now.
Right.
And so I did a live last week. You would have loved this. It was have it your way, but you can't.
Okay.
Because this isn't Burger King.
That would have been great to see. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, this is fat loss. This isn't Burger King.
Right.
You don't roll up into the window and get a double-double and, in and out and expect yourself every day to have a double-double because you're not going to have one. At some point, in dieting, you're going to be without the double-double. And you got to make do with what you have. And there's going to be periods of dieting that are going to be very difficult. It's the same thing with athletic performance. When your coach tells you to do something different and you've been programmed to do something a certain way for 10 years, there's some growing that happens. There's some struggling that happens. There's some, compromise that has to happen. And so it's like that with everyone. It's like that with Gen Pop. It's like that with athletes. It's like that with everybody. If you're doing nutrition and you're looking at it black and white, it's not. There's gray area.
Right.
There always is going to be. You look at science, it's not black and white.
Right.
It's always changing. I love it. Some people become so frustrated and affixed on, what science is changing. Next week, they're going to tell us that we have to do this. And it's like, well, until we know that, why don't we just keep doing what we're doing because it's working great?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And then wait till the research comes out to show us otherwise.
Wait to hate the data,
sure.
Don't hate me. It's like Lane Norton said, don't hate me, hate the data. So I always love that. I'm like, that is so true.
Yeah.
Like, people get mad at you because they were off on their data for the week, and you're like, you were the adult that made that decision to go out to dinner 3 times last week. Your data's off. Okay.
Right.
Let's do better this week. How about you just refocus?
Yeah.
But that's, the other thing too. Coming off of losses, losses are great opportunities for growth. For me as a nutrition coach, for the coach, a lot of times it's what I need the coach to experience too with the athlete, to humble them, to open them up to the possibility that the things that I've been suggesting might actually have merit.
Right.
And then we have compromise.
Okay.
So, same thing, husband, wife.
Yeah. So
disagree.
So you can come back and listen to what you say for sure.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I think we threw a lot of information at you. Let me go ahead and summarize some of the stuff that we said. So Kelli said that if you are a CrossFit athlete, a great base balance would be for macronutrients would be 40% carbs, 30% fat, 30% protein. Now there is some tweaking that can come after that. And a lot of that tweaking isn't a magic number. It's based on how you feel. And so what the things you want to look at are recovery, sleep, performance, the aesthetics, obviously, as well. And then if you are at a deficit, so let's say you're not hitting that 40-30-30, you don't want to jump into it right away. To take it slow and kind of slowly increase those deficits when you need to. And don't jump in entirely, because you might mess up some stuff in that case. Obviously, just like in the last 2 episodes we talked about, adherence is a big thing. Take a vacation from tracking, or else you're gonna end up hating your life. And so take a vacation. That way you're able to kind of stick to it longer than as opposed to jumping all in right away. Some of the other things that she mentioned were, if you're looking for supplements to kind of help you out as well, this research shows that whey protein, creatine monohydrate, and caffeine all help increase performance
and recovery.
Mm-hmm. So those are some great ones to start off with, and you can do some research, figure out what brands you like, or you can ask Kelli directly. And of course, the easiest way to track all the macronutrients is just using MyFitnessPal, another tracker. Again, there's no affiliation with any of these companies, but you can use that and kind of give you an idea of what you're working with. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Kelli?
No, I think just, I always like to give one takeaway from each episode, and that would be, for this one in particular, because of the nature of what we do and being such elite athletes, make sure that you take a vacation so that you still love what you're doing all the time.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, because anything that you do every day becomes a job, and you don't want to burn out. You still want to have the love for it. You want to be able to leave it and come back to it and still enjoy it. So try not to be American when it comes to that.
Yeah, I love that.
Try not to. Just set up the vacations and the diet breaks and the breaks from training and a deload week. A week where, you can just go and do something completely different, even if it's fitness related, and you come back and you're like, yeah, this is great. I'm ready to work again.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go. So
awesome.
That's it.
No, that's perfect. So yeah, in episode 4, we're going to be talking about how you use macro tracking for the general population that wants to lose those 10 to 15 pounds. So we'll have Kelli back on for that. And until then, we hope you enjoyed listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for being here, Kelli.
Yeah. This one, the